live streaming. Probably I will need to mute my. Okay, here we go. We are live on Facebook. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a new session on the stories from Max people. For those of you that is the first time joining one of our sessions, I present myself. I'm Patricia Martinez. I'm a project manager at AIDL. And AIDL is one of the 20 partners that work in the MAX project, Maximizing Migrants' Contribution to Society. MAX is funded by the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund of the European Union. And our main goal is to raise awareness about the positive contribution that migration has in our societies. And to do this, we work on three key pillars. The first one is researching and communicating not only on figures and facts about diversity in the European Union, but also bringing to the front the real stories of the people behind the migration movement. Also training students and professionals on how to report about migration issues. And third, creating encounters between native-born population and newcomers to join, to interact and to have joint debates. So today, we are going to address the second of those three pillars, the so-called solution journalism paradigm. And for that, we have two of the experts from the European news organization, The Local. Hi, Catherine Edwards, and hi, Jessica Phelan. Welcome and thanks for joining this afternoon. So, as we anticipated, what we are going to hear today is from you, the work that you've been doing during these last 2 years already on shaping a specific curriculum for the solution journalists with a focus on migration reporting, all the training you have done, what has been the feedback from the participants, and all you have learned through the process. So thanks again, Catherine and Jessica, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. So what we thought we would do today is kind of give an introduction, a sort of glimpse of the training, a little bit of the training that we gave to journalists over the past year. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen now so that you'll be able to see the presentation that we gave to journalists, or a version of it. Basically, we managed to train in the end over 100 journalists from around 20 countries around Europe. This was a mix of professional journalists and of student journalists. And we had to conduct all of the training online, obviously, because it was 2020. But that, in the end, kind of allowed us to reach quite a wide range of people across Europe. And so we delivered a variety of webinars and workshops and individual mentoring. So obviously, we're not going to go through all of it today, but we thought we'd give you a kind of overview of what exactly solutions journalism is and how we think it can apply to migration reporting, what we think it can add. And we're going to look at some of the examples of stories that our trainees ended up writing, a couple of our favorites. So I will hand over to Catherine, who'll start presenting some of the things that we talked about in our sessions with journalists.
Thanks. Yeah, so when we did the training, one of the first things we did was to start by discussing what migration reporting looks like at the moment around Europe. And one thing that people brought up again and again was that there's a lack of nuance. So these are some headlines we found when we searched migration on Google News in English language reporting. And I'm sure you recognize these kinds of headlines, which on this page, they report on migration mostly as a negative thing, both for the people migrating and for the places that they move to, which can lead to stigmatization or xenophobia, And in these kinds of headlines, migrants are often dehumanized. We don't really hear about who these people are, why they're moving, where they're moving from. It focuses on just one point in the migration journey. It focuses on the crisis point. And even when they're telling stories that need to be told about tragedies and difficult situations people are facing, even in those stories, we found that the people being talked about were often just being talked about. They weren't being interviewed themselves or having their voices heard. And that's not good for those people, but it's also not good for readers, because if you're constantly reading about how bad the situation is, how this is a migration tragedy or a migration crisis, it can be overwhelming. You feel a sort of despair and feel like nothing can be done. And it's just not consistent with most people's experience of migration. It's not the whole story. On the other side, we found a lot of examples of positive stories about migration, stories of the migrants who make it. And these are clearly stories that need to be told. In these articles that we found, the migrants we're talking about, they're no longer anonymous. We start to hear more detail about individuals, and they're presented in a way that shows they have some autonomy, some control over their lives. They're closer to being presented as heroes rather than victims or threats. And these stories are really important to include, but we found that they all spoke about really extraordinary moments, things that either require an extraordinary level of talent, of skill, or just being in the right place at the right time and having a lot of luck. And that could suggest that migrants have to do something that extraordinary to be worth having their stories told, or even to be worth being accepted in Europe. And it still only focuses on very specific points, kind of the end point after they've moved to the country and finally been accepted. We don't really hear about the before and after, the journey, the main bit. So this still isn't the whole story. What we need is to hear more about the everyday situations people are in, the challenges they're facing, and the contributions they're making, so that we can see a more complete picture of migration in Europe and have that represented in the news.
So we thought that we think that solutions journalism can be part of that bigger picture, or that more complete picture. This is kind of the most basic definition of solutions journalism that we can give. It's not just stories of people who make it. So, you know, someone who has an extraordinary skill or an extraordinary talent. It's stories of how people make it. So the key word there is how. Like we would tell our journalists, think of this as a kind of case study of success. And as Catherine mentioned, that involves kind of having a slightly different concept of success, not just someone who wins a prize or someone who competes in the Olympics, but maybe success can be defined as those more everyday moments, the things that actually are more common and recognizable in most people's experiences. So really, we're looking for the kinds of successes that are maybe smaller and maybe more common, but they're also the successes that we can repeat and that people can learn something from, because maybe they can find a way to achieve a similar success by studying how other people did it. So what that means for journalists is really just kind of asking a lot of questions about every element of these success stories. So you don't just kind of write this nice story where someone achieves something and you leave it at that. You ask, okay, what did they achieve? How did they achieve it? How many people benefited? What exactly did they do? What were the steps? What did they do first? What did they do next? How much did it cost? Is there a way that someone else could do it better? Like, what were the limitations? What were the problems that they found along the way? Did they overcome them? How did they overcome them? Maybe they didn't overcome them, and maybe that's something that that we need to learn from too. And really, the biggest goal in doing all of this is to really kind of build a full picture of how something works. We would often tell our journalists, like, imagine you're writing for someone who is thinking about doing this project themselves. So you're writing not just for people who are kind of going to read about this and then forget about it. Imagine you're writing for someone who really wants to learn from this, someone who knows about the subject, or someone to whom it's really relevant, and they need to know step by step what this project involves, which is obviously a slightly different way of thinking about journalism. It involves thinking about journalism as something that's really kind of, that has practical applications.
So this is a look at the 5 criteria that we gave the journalists for writing their own articles. And this is very closely based on work from an organization called the Solutions Journalism Network, which started in the US. And they don't look specifically at migration. They apply this to all kinds of reporting. So we looked at what it would mean for migration reporting. So we'll just explain what it includes briefly, and then we'll look at 2 articles that our trainees produce so that you can see what this means in practice. But firstly, as Jessica just explained, it really looks into a response to a problem. I think as journalists, it's very natural to look for the problems. It's important to do to raise awareness of what's going wrong and what needs to be fixed. But sometimes there are people who are already working to fix it or have even managed to fix something. And those are the stories that often are missing. So this looks for responses that are already in progress, who's already doing something. And we don't just take their word for it. Firstly, you would go into depth on really how the response works, what exactly it involves, because it's one thing to say you're, for example, helping migrants get jobs, but how do you do that? Is it through offering training or offering language classes or working directly with employers? What exactly are they doing that is fixing the problem? It might not be the thing that you would immediately guess. We need to know evidence of impact. Just because someone's doing something and it's a great idea and they're hoping it fixes the problem, you need to look for evidence. And that could be from data, numbers of people who've been affected, signs of improvement over time. And most importantly, it's often from speaking to people who've been through that program or who've been helped by this response. So looking at how well something works and how we know it's working, how to measure that. And that also includes looking at the limitations, which again, when you're trying to report on something that's a positive step, it's often, I think people often naturally don't want to include the limitations because you don't want to be tearing it apart when it's clearly going in the right direction. But that's actually a really important thing to include, because very often there aren't perfect solutions. Maybe it can only address part of the problem, or it can only at the moment help certain people. And that's not necessarily a failure of the project. It could be to do with lack of funding, or it could be something that they need help to improve. So again, it's part of giving the full picture. And maybe those are things that could be improved in the future. And with those things, you should end up with teachable insights, so things that other people can learn from. So we hoped to get a blueprint in each article that sketches out what's happening, how it happens, how we know that it's working, and maybe where it hasn't worked, where it still needs to be further improved. So the insight comes in handy, especially for people who want to learn from this response, maybe copy it elsewhere, because maybe other people aren't going to use the exact same steps and do it the exact same way in a different place or a different situation. And maybe they won't have the exact same results in a different context. But if you have that idea behind it that really shows how it works and maybe what is different about this response, that's the thing that people can really take away and learn from in the future. So that's what we were aiming to get out of solutions journalism articles in the course.
Oops. So obviously this is a kind of new way of doing journalism, and journalists are often skeptical people, as are editors, who they have to, we had to convince the journalists, and the journalists might themselves then have to convince their editors to kind of try this slightly different way of doing journalism. So we kind of had to give them a bit of a pitch about why they should try this slightly different style of reporting. So this is a kind of summary of the advantages of solutions journalism that we talked about. There are various studies to show that readers actually want to hear a different side of the news. They don't necessarily want to hear only negative stories. They tend to spend more time on online stories that are focusing on solutions and responses. They tend to share them on social media more widely. So there's some evidence that this is what readers are interested in. It can also contribute to kind of public discourse if people, one thing that we say is that it unsticks conversations. So if you find that there are certain topics that everyone seems to be saying the same thing over and over again, and people are kind of entrenched in their positions, and it doesn't seem like we're moving forward with the debate, then this is a kind of a way of adding to it that acknowledges both sides of the picture and maybe casts a new light on it. So certainly with migration, we felt like, that's really something that applies here. At the same time, it's not just puff pieces, it's not propaganda, it's not fluffy, it's real journalism that's based on evidence, data, testimonies, and examining both sides. We should always kind of look at the limitations of each response. It's not just kind of happy stories, it's always getting into depth about things. And another thing that's really valuable about it is that it can hold people accountable, because once people realize, like, oh, okay, maybe there is something that we could be doing that would improve this situation, then you no longer really have an excuse not to do it. So if there is something that's working, why isn't my town trying this, or why aren't politicians here doing this? So it's actually a kind of important way of showing people that things can work or can make a difference. And ultimately, it gives a fuller picture. It's not just, if you think back to those headlines that we looked at right at the beginning, those really aren't the whole story of migration by any means. And this contributes to kind of adding some of that nuance, to looking at more points of people's experience along, different experiences of migration, different experiences in the process of migration, taking a longer term view, taking a more balanced view. So these are some of the reasons that we think that people should be applying migration solutions reporting to migration stories.
So we're going to look through just two examples from the articles that our trainees wrote. In the end, they wrote more than 40 stories using this framework, and we'll send the link around so that you can read them in full if you want to. So this one was by one of our trainees, Dimitra, and she looked at a problem in her country, Greece, which was not just increasing numbers of new arrivals, but what that meant for their future in the country, which was a high unemployment rate compared to local residents. And there are several factors behind that, like language barriers, like discrimination and bureaucracy. And Dimitra looked into one organization that is working to solve this problem. And what I really like about the response that she chose is that it looks at both how to help the individuals and also how to tackle the root cause of the problem. So it's really aiming for that full picture. So here are some of the extracts that show those points of solutions journalism in practice. So here you get very specific details of what the organization is doing. It's not vague, oh, it's helping people find jobs. She lists out the different services they offer. So counseling, guidance sessions, help with resumes and interviews, skills development, Greek language classes, labour rights seminars. And then the other side of it, which is helping the employers in Greece, preparing them for diversity, because it needs both sides to be working together. So they're training Greek employers on things like how to deal with residence permit issues and also connecting them with the people they meet. So if you compare this to some of the stories we looked at in the positive news that celebrate a migrant who might have successfully started a business or got a great job, those are good stories to cover, but they don't show how others can do the same. And this looks in both sides of it, how the individuals can be helped and how the labour market in general can be improved for them. And next we've got the proof that it's working. So they're not just making the big claims, they're not just holding all these seminars and hoping that it works. We've got numbers of how many people got a job through this program. So Demetria spoke to one refugee who had been in contact with the NGO and used their career counselling, and he had got a job as a result. And she spoke to him about what was particularly helpful about it to find out his direct experience. And then the data that backs it up shows that his story isn't a one-off or an accident. They're getting a lot of people, hundreds, to job interviews, and then a good proportion of those are getting jobs as a result, and that number is going up. So this is really promising evidence that this response actually is working and can be a solution to the problem. And that gives what I think is a really interesting article. I recommend reading the whole thing. And it's the kind of article that can have an impact because it shows how change has happened, how change can happen because it's already happened in this organization. And this slide gives the real take-home message of the article. So this is what we mean when we talk about insights and having an impact and something that others can learn from. So we've had the explanation of the different things that the organization offers, all the different programs they do, and their data that shows it works. But this is really what matters most, because they're not just hooking migrants up with a job. They say they're not the ones who will find a job for them like an agency. What they're aiming to do is to empower people to do it themselves. And the focus is on the empowerment. It's not that individual transaction with getting them a job. And that's hard to measure, of course. And then this quote from one of the careers counsellors, that just finding a job is not enough. We want people who come here to find a job that is legitimate and fair. And so that's why they offer seminars not just on the job market in Greece, but this organisation was focusing a lot on labour rights seminars so that they're not only counting how many people can they get into any old job or just on increasing the employment rate among the people that they help. They really want people to understand the job market and get a good job, a fair and legal job, so that they can do it themselves. And that's ultimately going to be what levels the playing field, because however much this organization scales up, they wouldn't be able to help every single migrant get every single job, but they're aiming to help the individuals and lead to a kind of cultural change. And that's what they're working towards. And I think because we have the personal testimony and the data, we can really see exactly how they're achieving that, and the proof that so far it seems to be working quite well.
So here's another example from another of our trainees, a German trainee, Hannah Lesch, and she was looking at the issue of housing in Hamburg, which is difficult for everyone to find because it's a very crowded housing market, but it's especially difficult for people who have arrived as refugees and need to get into the private housing market for the first time, and often find that they have trouble finding, navigating this new system, and also that they can encounter some kind of resistance from landlords and even from other residents. So Hannah looked at a scheme that kind of that pairs up local volunteers with families, refugee families who are looking for housing. So how it works is that there's basically a kind of what they call a housing pilot. That's someone who speaks fluent German, who has rented in Hamburg before, who kind of helps refugee families who are looking for housing to kind of navigate and to interact with landlords, to negotiate contracts, that kind of thing. So, you know, very much as Catherine was saying with the other example, it's not just a question of sort of getting individual families into housing and doing everything for them and being a kind of just a sort of agency service. It's very much working with landlords as well to kind of make a difference to the way that they think about this, to maybe show them that actually some of their concerns or their prejudices against immigrants and against refugees, specifically about renting to them, some of those might be misplaced. So the role of these local volunteers isn't just to kind of hold people's hands, hold refugees' hands as they look for a house the first time, but it's actually to kind of address some of the issues that local landlords have, and by doing that to hopefully kind of make a larger and more lasting difference. So again, we have some data about how many people have been involved in this. So around 800 households, that's more than 2,000 people. So it's great to show how many people have helped. What I think is also really important is that she shows there's still 400 households waiting to be helped. So that gives you a great idea of the scale of this. So it's not just celebrating, oh, look, we've helped this many people. It's also pointing out, okay, but there's also this many people who are still waiting, and there are reasons why they haven't been able to find a house yet. She also points out that, you know, sometimes you have to make compromises. It's difficult to find housing that's big enough sometimes because there's so much pressure on the housing market. So she does a good job of looking at some of the limitations of the scheme as well. But what I think I love most about this article is that she does such a good job of showing the value of this scheme. And this is something that we really try to emphasize to our trainees, is that the best way to know if something has helped or if something is working or not is to speak to the people who are supposed to be helped by it, the people who are supposed to be benefiting from it. So she spoke to this particular family from Syria, who had recently moved into a new apartment with the help of one of these local volunteers who'd kind of helped them negotiate with their landlord. And she really brings to life exactly what that has meant for this family. So the father of the family, for example, feels that now he's got stable housing, he can pursue a training course. So it really shows, you know, it's never just about one issue. If you have housing, there are so many other benefits that brings to your life. And I think she really did a great job of bringing that to the foreground. So that's kind of another element of solutions reporting about migration, is that we really try to encourage people to go directly to the people who were supposed to be helped by these schemes or these projects and ask them, has this helped you? How has it helped you? What hasn't it helped with? And what is the value of that to your life? So hopefully kind of trying to put migrants' voices and refugees' voices a bit more prominently in the reporting that we do. So those are just two of the examples of articles that our trainees wrote. We had almost 50 articles in the end that kind of came out of the course. So we'd really obviously encourage you to take a look at that section on the local. I think we'll share a link to these specific articles. And from there, you can find all the others as well. We really had a great variety of stories about all kinds of issues and in a lot of different countries as well, which was great.
Thank you very much, Jessica and Catherine. It's been really informative. I think we learned a lot of insights on how the solution journalism works, so the criteria and how to look at it. We had actually one question from one attendee that was actually interested in the training itself. It was asking if it was part of the project, that this specific activity it was done as part of the MAX project, and is asking if you are considering actually implementing new solution journalism training in the future. There is maybe possibilities for that in the future.
Thanks. It's really great to hear that people are interested in it, and we've heard from a lot of journalists who are excited about this way of reporting. At the moment, at the local, we aren't planning to run this training course again in the near future, but we can share the materials that we made. We've got the curriculum and the slides that we used with the trainees, and we're happy to share those with anyone who's interested. And to learn more about solutions journalism in general, there are several organizations that work with this around the world. So it's possible to find training courses, even if they're not so focused on migration.
Indeed, it might be an opportunity for you in the future, since it seems that it's so relevant and really good timing for doing it. But yes, everybody can access all the materials also in the maxamif.eu website. Before we wrap up, I actually wanted to ask you, because this is a super comprehensive way of reporting about migration, but what do you think, in your opinions, could be the main obstacles to really have all these criteria embedded in a news about migration?
Yeah, that is a good question. That's certainly something that that we got asked by participants as well. I think this kind of reporting, because it's comprehensive, it can be quite kind of resource intensive. We found that a tendency is to write very long articles because you're trying to include all of the different criteria, and some people kind of get a bit thrown off by the idea of looking for evidence as well. Like, you know, there's a tendency to think evidence has to be numbers, and therefore I can only write about something if there's been a big study that will give me a lot of data about it or something, or maybe the solution isn't perfect, so should I maybe not write about it? All of which can be kind of adapted. You can, you can look for evidence in different forms. You can speak to people rather than having data, and you can also acknowledge that something isn't complete or isn't perfect. But it does take a kind of a shift in mindset, and we found that with our trainees, a lot of them found it a lot easier to identify the problem rather than the solution. Hopefully, we kind of, got them to start thinking in a more solutions orientated way, but it is true that it does take quite a lot of work and quite a lot of asking questions that perhaps people aren't used to asking, and also people aren't used to answering. Sometimes interviewees just aren't expecting to be asked in that much detail about what they actually do. We think that's something that you can kind of overcome with practice. But it's true that it does take a little bit of work to kind of maybe convince people to try something different, which is, part of why we try to sort of show the advantages and why it might be worth putting in that extra time and legwork to do one of these stories.
Mm-hmm. It sounds worth it, definitely. Okay, so before we wrap up, the last question I wanted to ask you is, how do you think that the media could help still? There is anything beyond this precise reporting that they could do, in your opinion, to help in changing the narrative around the migration discourse that unfortunately tends to be rather negative nowadays?
I think As well as, of course, I would say taking the time to commission in-depth articles on migration, to commission people with direct experience of migration. But as well as that, just increasing the coverage, I think it's possible to improve it, even if it's not necessarily a solutions journalism article every single time with those 5 criteria. Even if you're writing an article that does focus on a problem, you can still think about how to incorporate those things. So whether it's getting more data, more evidence, and most of all, getting people's voices, migrants' voices in the articles, even if you don't have time to delve into all the aspects of a problem or a response and find a lot of evidence, it should be possible to get the voices of the people who you're talking about in your articles. It's not necessarily quite as easy as it sounds, because it requires building trust and building relationships with a community that maybe some media haven't been thinking about so much before. But that's really the first step, is to start speaking to people instead of just writing about them. A lot of media are doing this now, and I think that just needs to continue more and more.
Definitely. Okay, thank you very much again, Catherine and Jessica. Thanks for the presentation today, for all the work you've been doing with Max, and for helping in raising awareness, in communicating the voices of migrants, real stories around Europe. We have to close for today because time is up. But as we said, please follow up on this Facebook channel, on the maxamif.eu website, and we will be back very soon with more stories from Max people. Thank you, and have a nice afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.